Why did ancient humans suddenly stop eating meat for 1,000 years? Something is wrong with the bones. That is the first thing the archaeologists noticed. The skeleton was roughly 12,000 years old, buried in a shallow grave in what is now the Jordan Valley in the Middle East. The bones were intact. The burial was careful. Someone had placed the body deliberately, with attention. But the bones themselves told a different story. No meat. Almost none. For the last years of this person's life, they had eaten almost exclusively plants, seeds, roots, wild grasses. The chemical signature locked inside the calcium of those bones was unmistakable. And this was not one person. It was thousands of them, across an entire region, across nearly 1,000 years. Something happened around 12,000 to 11,000 BC that caused a massive, widespread shift in what human beings ate. A shift away from the large game animals that had sustained our species for hundreds of thousands of years. A shift toward plants, grains, and seeds in quantities never seen before. The question is not whether this happened. The question is why. And the answer, when you follow it all the way down, is one of the most important stories in all of human history. To understand what changed, you need to understand what came before. For at least 200,000 years, Homo sapiens were what biologists call megafauna hunters, large animal hunters. Mammoth, aurochs, giant ground sloth, cave bear, woolly rhinoceros. Animals that weighed hundreds or thousands of kilograms and provided enormous amounts of protein, fat, and calories in a single kill. Isotope analysis of ancient bones from this period consistently shows a diet dominated by animal protein. Roughly 50 to 70% of calories from meat, depending on the region and the season. This was not occasional. This was the foundation of human nutrition for virtually the entire existence of our species up to that point. Paleontologist Paul Martin of the University of Arizona spent decades studying what he called the Pleistocene overkill hypothesis. His research, compiled across thousands of fossil sites on every inhabited continent, documented a pattern that repeats with remarkable consistency wherever modern humans arrived for the first time. The large animals disappear. Not all at once, not overnight, but within a few thousand years of human arrival, the megafauna collapses. In North America, 33 out of 45 genera of large mammals went extinct between 13,000 and 10,000 years ago. In Australia, the pattern began even earlier, around 46,000 years ago, coinciding almost precisely with the first evidence of human habitation on the continent. The debate among scientists is whether climate change or human hunting was the primary driver. The honest answer is probably both. But the consequence was the same either way. By 12,000 BC, in the Fertile Crescent of the Middle East, the large animals were running out. And that is when something extraordinary happened. Facing a protein crisis unlike anything our species had experienced in living memory, ancient humans in the region we now call the Levant did something that had never been done before in the history of any primate on Earth. They started farming. Not immediately, not consciously, not as a planned decision made by wise elders around a fire. It happened slowly, incrementally, almost accidentally. Archaeobotanist Dolores Piperno of the Smithsonian Institution has spent her career studying the transition from wild plant gathering to intentional cultivation. Her analysis of plant remains at sites across the Fertile Crescent shows a gradual shift beginning around 23,000 years ago at a site called Oholotsekh on the shores of the Sea of Galilee. Ancient humans there were already storing wild barley and wheat in quantities that suggest deliberate collection rather than casual foraging. But it was not until the megafauna collapsed that this behavior became the dominant survival strategy. When the mammoth disappeared, the grain became dinner. The people we are talking about are called the Natufians. They lived in the Levant, in what is now Israel, Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria, between roughly 15,000 and 11,500 years ago. They are one of the most intensively studied prehistoric cultures on the planet, because what happened to them changed the course of human civilization permanently. The Natufians began as hunter-gatherers in the most traditional sense. Early Natufian settlements show abundant evidence of hunting: gazelle bones, wild boar remains, deer, aurochs. The diet was varied, balanced, and heavily dependent on animal protein. Then something shifts. Archaeologist Ofer Bar Yosef of Harvard University, who spent much of his career excavating Natufian sites, documented the transition in painstaking detail. Around 13,000 to 12,000 years ago, the faunal remains at Natufian sites begin to change. The large game bones become less frequent. The plant processing tools, mortars, grinding stones, sickle blades become more common. The people are eating differently. And the bones confirm it. Isotope analysis of Natufian skeletons from the later period shows a dramatic reduction in animal protein consumption. Some individuals show dietary profiles that are almost entirely plant-based for extended periods. They did not choose this. The animals chose it for them. But here is what makes this story genuinely strange. The transition was not smooth. It was not a gentle glide from hunting to farming. For the human body, it was a disaster. Physical anthropologist Clark Spencer Larson of Ohio State University has compiled what may be the most comprehensive analysis of skeletal health across the agricultural transition. His findings, published across decades of research, are blunt and consistent. When humans stop eating meat and start eating grain, their bodies suffer. Stature decreases. Average height drops by several centimeters across just a few generations as protein intake falls. Bone density decreases. Dental cavities, virtually absent in hunter-gatherer populations who ate little sugar and no refined grain, explode in frequency. Iron deficiency anemia, visible in the characteristic pitting of eye socket bones called cribra orbitalia, becomes common. One Natufian cemetery at a site called Ain Ghazal in modern Jordan shows skeletal pathologies consistent with chronic malnutrition in a significant percentage of individuals. These people were not thriving on their new diet. They were surviving it, and yet they kept doing it. Generation after generation, they refined the process. They learned which grasses produce the most seed. They learned to store grain. They learned to replant. They learned irrigation. They learned to breed animals rather than hunt them. They were learning how to farm. And roughly 10,000 years ago, at a site called Göbekli Tepe in what is now southern Turkey, and at dozens of other sites across the Fertile Crescent, the first true agricultural settlements appear. The experiment that began with the disappearance of the mammoth had produced something entirely new. But there is a second question buried inside this story that most people never think to ask. Why did they stop eating meat specifically? The animals did not all vanish overnight. Archaeological evidence shows that wild game remained available throughout this period, just in smaller quantities and requiring more effort to find. Some communities continued hunting throughout the transition. So why did so many people in so many places shift so dramatically away from animal protein? Researcher Amanda Henry of the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology has studied the dental calculus, the hardened plaque, on Neanderthal and early human teeth. Her analysis reveals something remarkable. Even deep in the Paleolithic, long before farming, human beings were processing and eating plants in much larger quantities than the bone record suggested. The plants were always part of the diet. The transition was not from pure meat to pure plants. It was a shift in proportion, driven by necessity, which then locked in through culture, habit, and infrastructure. Once you build a grain storage pit, you are committed to grain. Once you build a grinding stone, you grind grain. Once your settlement is positioned near a good wild wheat field, your children grow up in a world where wheat is central to existence. The meat disappeared, the plants filled the gap, and the gap became a foundation. There's one more piece of this story worth following. The Younger Dryas. Between approximately 12,900 and 11,700 years ago, the Earth experienced a sudden, severe return to near-glacial conditions. Average temperatures in the northern hemisphere dropped by as much as 10 degrees Celsius within a matter of decades. Rainfall patterns shifted dramatically. Many of the plant-rich environments that early humans had come to depend on shrank or disappeared. Climate scientists William Broker and George Denton were among the first to document the full severity of the Younger Dryas cooling event, a period so dramatic it appears in ice cores, ocean sediments, and pollen records on every continent. For the Natufians and other populations in the Levant, the Younger Dryas was catastrophic. Some settlements were abandoned. Some populations contracted sharply. The diversity of the diet narrowed even further as resources became scarce. And yet, at the end of the Younger Dryas, when temperatures rebounded and rainfall returned around 11,700 years ago, something remarkable happened. The populations that had survived did not simply return to hunting. They accelerated the agricultural experiment that the crisis had forced them to begin. The crisis had not broken them. It had trained them. So here is what actually happened. Your ancestors did not choose to stop eating meat. The world stopped providing it at the scale they needed. The megafauna collapsed. The climate destabilized. The protein supply that had sustained human beings for 200,000 years became unreliable. And in that gap, in that 1,000-year struggle to survive on seeds and roots and wild grasses, the foundation of everything that came after was laid. Writing. Cities, governments, religion, trade, war, all of it required surplus food. All surplus food required agriculture, and agriculture required the catastrophe of the meat running out. The famine was the invention. The crisis was the civilization. You are sitting in a world built by people who were trying not to starve. They figured out grain because they had no choice, and because they did, you are here.